Well, Ani, hello. Welcome to Nagpra 101, the basics under the law. My name is Eric Hemenway. I am an Anishinaabe historian from Northern Michigan, and I am going to be your instructor for this module on the basics of Nagpra. I have about 20 years experience of doing Nagpra as a practitioner and also as a trainer of helping others learn about the law. So I'm very happy to be here today to share my expertise, my stories, and to help others facilitate this very important law within the United States. The NAGPRA 101, we just need to know the basics first before we get started. So NAGPRA, the Native American Rights Protection and Repatriation Act, is a federal law. It was passed in 1990, and this law focuses on the return of Native American human remains and cultural items. And cultural items, we'll get into, there's very more specific details on what these cultural items are. And this training will cover the basics of the law, who the law applies to, and the background of why the law was created, which I feel is a very important part of this training to give those who are just starting out in the law an understanding of why this is created. And in my estimation and in my understanding, NAGPRA is an extension of the Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. So Native people in the United States had to have a law to openly practice their religious practices. And it's something that most people don't know about, but it's true. And in my mind, NAGPRA is an extension of that Religious Freedom Act because many Native people across the country saw the need to have their ancestors return as part of their ceremonies, part of their religion, part of their belief system, what have you, and also to reclaim many of the sacred items that have been taken or alienated from their communities. So I often reference the Indian Religious Freedom Act when I'm talking about NAGPRA. So what do we hope to learn? What is NAGPRA? And very importantly, who does it apply to? What are some of the basics under the law? And again, why was this created? So what is NAGPRA? When I first started doing NAGPRA roughly 20 years ago, as a practitioner, I'm no longer a practitioner, I'm more of a trainer, and I didn't know what the law was. And so I had to immerse myself in what this law was, do my homework, bring myself up to speed. And it's a federal law, and federal law, of course, supersedes state law. It was passed in 1990, so it's a rather recent law. And Native people have a plethora of laws that govern them in this country. I think we're one of the most legislated people in this country, and NAGPRA is one of these laws for Native people. But it just doesn't only apply to Native people. It applies to institutions, governments, museums, agencies, federal agencies, Native American tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and tribes within the United States. So this is also including, of course, Alaska and Hawaii and the continental United States. But NAGPRA is not, and I stress this very heavily, not an international law. It only applies to within our own borders. So even within Canada and Mexico, items or human remains are on our bordering countries, NAGPRA doesn't apply to them. So this is just for the United States. It's not to say that tribes can reach out to those other countries and ask for repatriation or try to facilitate repatriation. It's just NAGPRA won't apply to outside of our own borders. Even though items may have come from the United States to go outside of the United States, NAGPRA only applies here. In the Smithsonian Institution has its own repatriation laws that actually predate the federal law by 1 year in 1989. So the Smithsonian has its own repatriation law. NAGPRA does not apply to the National Museum of the American Indian or the Natural History Museum within the Smithsonian system. They have their own separate law, their own separate regulations, their own separate review committee. It's a process that oftentimes resembles NAGPRA, but it's entirely different in a lot of regards. So that's a whole nother discussion, a whole nother training topic. NAGPRA does not apply to the Smithsonian. And NAGPRA is a pretty dynamic law. It's multifaceted legislation. It covers property, civil rights, human rights, and it's Indian law. So NAGPRA can go in and out of a lot of different fields very quickly. So through this training, we're going to touch upon some of these different areas that NAGPRA can apply to. In that term, we use Indian country, And Indian country is a legal term, and it's a term that applies to Native communities, populations, current events, history, land use, jurisdiction. So we're going to see how NAGPRA applies within Indian country, then out of Indian country of communities that are non-native. And again, NAGPRA is very dynamic. NAGPRA addresses NHOs, Native Hawaiian organizations. It touches on religion, touches on science, language, and the relationship of Native communities with the federal government, which is often very complicated, very tense over history. And it's a very unique piece of legislation, and the fact that it does touch on all of these very quickly at times. So, and NAGPRA also is one of the only laws that states that a Native oral tradition, a belief, has equal standing with Western scientific evidence. So traditional knowledge, oral histories, the things that Native people have been using for thousands of years is held to the same standard of Western science within the law. So that's a very unique aspect of NAGPRA. When I first started doing NAGPRA, I had to figure out who follows the law. Does it apply to everybody or just a museum? And so the jurisdiction issue of NAGPRA is something that you have to resolve immediately. If you're a federally recognized tribe, NAGPRA automatically applies to you. But if you're not a federally recognized tribe and you are a non-native organization, just exactly where does NAGPRA fall into your scope of work? So museums, and museums have a different definition under NAGPRA than your atypical idea of what a museum is. And so quickly going through the law, I found that a museum is any institution that has received federal funds at any time in its existence. So this includes private and public museums. If it's no matter the size, it could be your large state museum, it could be a very small local museum, but if they've received federal funds to have some type of employment or some type of improvements, any type of federal money is through a grant or what have you, if that money has a history with that institution, then NAGPRA applies to that institution. So that's one of the first institutions that I learned very quickly about. And then also states. Every single state has received federal funds at some point. So all of your states are considered museums under NAGPRA. So this is your Department of Transportation, your Natural Resource Department, your state museum, your natural resources, I already said. So there's a lot of different departments within a state government where NAGPRA could possibly fall under. Because if they're discovering human remains, it could be on state land, it could be a state park. If they're putting a road in, which is very common where states, departments of transportation work with tribes and they have their own MOU or memorandum of understanding with tribes because they're the ones who are breaking ground most often and have a very high likelihood of having an inadvertent discovery of human remains. So departments of transportation for states is one of the big ones. Your local municipalities. We had a case many years ago that I was a part of in a small way where a local city here in Michigan inherited a collection from a local collector. Very eccentric person, and this is very common in the early 20th century. A lot of these guys would go out, they had seemed like infinite funds and means to go and buy, but they were also pretty unethical with their digging and collecting. So they go and dig up burials, they go and just buy things that they shouldn't be buying. They just amass these massive collections. And this is very common across the United States in early 20th century. And these individuals come to a certain age, they're elderly, and they want their legacy to live on, so to speak. And this one individual donated literally thousands of items to a local city, and they took it. They seen that this is a very rare collection. There was a lot of things that weren't native, but there was things that were native. A huge collection of native material from all over the country. So once this city inherited that collection, NAGPRA applied because they have received federal funds in the past. And it came to their attention very quickly that we have a law that is tied to all of these things, and actually remains as well, that we have to apply, that we have to focus on right now. So they talked to their lawyers and they started talking to local representatives of tribal nations. And I came in and kind of just went through their collections really quickly and said, yeah, this is all very relevant to Nagpra, whether it's these certain shirts or pipes or eagle feathers, all of this stuff is going to apply. So we have to go through this process of putting together summaries and inventories, which we'll talk about in other modules. But it was almost like the deer in the headlights scenario where the woman who was in charge of all of this said, I didn't know any of this until we signed the paperwork. So this is something that, you know, I put on people's radars, these municipalities, when they inherit these collections. Towns and cities, the same thing. And universities and colleges, you know, most universities, colleges have received federal funds, and these are some of the largest institutions I've personally worked with in the past on repatriations, especially these large research institutions that have sometimes tens of thousands of human remains. So colleges and universities are some of the first places I look to in terms of where does Nagpra apply. And then another one is our state police. And this is one that I've seen a lot more traction in the last several years, and with federal register notices, that a lot of state police and local police are starting to work under the law. The process, if you find a human body, you have to call the police first. That's the first thing. And they determine if it's a crime scene, murder victim, missing person, so on and so forth. And from that step, you know, you can go into further analysis if this is, you know, native or not, or how old it is. These are all things that we'll look at with inventories. But police are starting to work under the law quite a bit more because they sometimes inherit these collections from these discoveries, and nobody takes them. It's on private property. And some states have very weak private property laws where if you find human remains on the property, basically the property owner owns them. And a lot of property owners don't feel comfortable, you know, say we don't want these, and the state police just take them, and then they go through the process of repatriation. So state police is somewhere you want to look, or if you are a police department, you might want to look at your collections and see if you have human remains and if they are native or not. So that's some of the non-native organizations and institutions that Nagpra applies to. And Indian tribes. So Indian tribes, as defined by the law, is any band, nation, or other organization or community of Indians, including any Alaska Native villages as defined and established by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which is recognized as eligible for the special program and services provided by the United States to Indians because of their status as Indians. So there are federally recognized tribes and there are non-federally recognized tribes. Under the law, federally recognized tribes have the first say in any type of repatriations. But state recognized tribes or non-federally recognized tribes also have a place in Nagpra. Many times under the law, they have to work with the local federally recognized tribe if there is one in their vicinity. Some states don't have federally recognized tribes, they only have state recognized. So if there are no federally recognized tribes within that state, only state recognized tribes, there is a process for these state recognized tribes to go through and repatriate human remains and sacred objects. If there's a federally recognized tribe that has historical ties to an area, or they have the preference, but if there isn't, there's a mechanism. So that's how it is established under the law of what the definition of a tribe is. I am not here to, establish myself what a tribe is. It's a very complicated scenario within the United States of what is a tribe, what isn't, who's a tribal individual, who isn't. I'm just operating how the law states it. And then there is a party that trumps all claims, and that's the lineal descendant. So a lineal descendant has absolute authority in a repatriation if they can show that they have an unbroken kinship line to a set of remains or an object. So if there is a lineal descendant and they have all of their paperwork intact, it shows that there's this unbroken line from that ancestor or that item to that person to the present day. A lineal descendant claim is actually going to override a federally recognized tribe's claim to a set of remains or an item. But these are exceedingly rare. It's often difficult to have that type of documentation over time, whether it's 50 years or 200 years of showing this unbroken line of information within a family to another individual or an item. But if you can prove that and have that established, it's the strongest claim of those of a lineal descendant. So land is a very key component with Nagpra. And I say this all the time, everything's complicated in Indian country with tribes and tribal individuals. There's no straightforward answer in a lot of cases. That's just the world we live in as Native people in the United States. So Nagpra is very tied to land, and Nagpra applies to all federal and tribal lands. So this can be your federal parks, your Army, Navy, anything in the defense is federal land. BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, all of this applies. I mean, Nagpra applies to all federal land and all tribal land. So tribal lands is very unique to each individual tribe. Tribal lands include all areas within the exterior boundaries of a reservation, even though the tribe may not own the land within the reservation. So for example, a tribe may have their boundaries established with a 50,000 acre piece of land, but within that 50,000 acres, they may only own 20,000 acres. And the other remaining 30,000 are private, it's state, maybe some federals sprinkled in there. But if that reservation boundary is legally established, then Nagpra applies within the entire jurisdiction of that boundary, even if it's on state or private land. So that's a very important part to note about this. And this includes lands that are not held in federal trust by the tribe. You got to look at each individual tribe to determine what type of tribal lands they have. Not every tribe has a defined reservation. There's 400 different tribes in this country, and they're all sovereign, they're all unique. The establishment of reservation boundaries is an ongoing affair in Indian country. There's cases going to the Supreme Court every so often about what is a reservation, what are the boundaries. So it's very advisable to keep checking back and check to see what your tribe's land status currently is that you're working with. It could change. They could go to the Supreme Court, they could go to federal court and have a case resolved when they now have an established reservation boundary, or it may not be resolved. So it's just good to keep your ear to the ground for some of these legal proceedings in terms of land, because it could change. And not all tribes have reservations. Some tribes are federally recognized, and they have a few areas of land that's called tribal land that it's held in trust with the federal government. So the tribe is able to operate on those lands, but it's not within the defined boundaries of a reservation. But they may have the tribal administration, they may have some cultural areas, natural resources that's held in trust, but it's not quote unquote part of a reservation. So again, you just got to look at your neighbors if they're there and determine what type of tribal lands your neighbors have. And then you have removed tribes, which is something that a lot of people that I've seen tend to neglect. So most of the removed tribes are in Oklahoma and Kansas. There's a few in Wisconsin, but the vast amount of removed tribes are in Oklahoma, Kansas. And removed tribes are just that. There was a federal policy in the 1800s called the Indian Removal Act, and approximately 200,000 Native people were removed from their homelands to what they called Indian Territory. And most of the tribes that were removed were from east of the Mississippi. So areas such as Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania, many tribes on the East Coast, they were literally forced off their lands and to be relocated in Oklahoma, Kansas. But these removed tribes certainly have a say, and they have historic and cultural ties to their indigenous lands, primarily back east. So if you are Eastern organization or museum, such as in Tennessee or Kentucky, and you say, well, I'm looking at my current map and it says no federally recognized tribes in Kentucky, you got to look at Oklahoma, Kansas, and start consulting with the tribes who originally were from those home areas. So it's another layer of consultation and complication, but it's something that absolutely necessarily needs to get done under the law. And in Oklahoma, they have a different set of parameters with land. They're called allotments, and there are over 40 tribes in Oklahoma. It's unlike any other place in Indian country in the United States. So Oklahoma is its own set of circumstances, as is Hawaii and as is Alaska. So those are three areas that I really stress that need extra emphasis on detail, and they're very unique in how they operate within Indian country, is Oklahoma, Hawaii, and Alaska. And speaking of Hawaii, they have no reservations or allotments, but have lands held in trust for the use of native populations. So it's a different scenario out there. Alaska has only one reservation, but has numerous native Alaskan villages and corporations where Nagpra is applicable. So again, you have to study your home area if you're within these states, and it's different from state to state. It's different from tribe to tribe. So again, this is just one of the complications of the law, but it's absolutely necessary to understand where the tribes are. Are they on federal or trust land? Do they have a reservation? And if so, where's that reservation boundary go? What are the exact parameters of that reservation? And if you're in Alaska, Hawaii, or Oklahoma, you got to dig a little bit deeper in how those communities, those tribal communities, have land. What are the legal definitions of that land, and where does NAGPRA apply to it? So each state has its own burial and antiquities law for discoveries outside of federal and tribal lands. And this is something really important to have easily accessible, I would say, when you are doing the law, because you want to know what state laws are also applying in terms of if something doesn't fall under, say, you have this scenario where you have a reservation, the boundaries are established, but the tribe doesn't own all of the land within the reservation. They only own a certain percentage. So what happens, when you find remains? Of course, NAGPRA applies because of the boundary being established. But what if you have another scenario where there's a tribe, they don't have the reservation boundary established, but they own certain pockets of land in their homeland, in their homeland areas, and they find remains that are on state land or private land, but there's no reservation boundary. And so NAGPRA wouldn't necessarily apply immediately to that private land, probably for state land, because the state would inherit that collection, then NAGPRA applies. But on that private land, what happens? So having a clear idea of the state burial laws is very important, because a lot of times if it's on this private land and NAGPRA doesn't apply, you can look towards your antiquities laws or your state burial laws and start operating with those and have those remain, follow that process. And I've seen a lot of times where in Michigan, unfortunately, we have pretty weak burial laws when it comes to private land. And so we're trying to establish different types of relationships with landowners and bring awareness that if you do find these, call the police and so on and so forth. But then, having this relationship established between, these local tribes and the community. So when remains are found, the local property owner knows what to do. They call the police. We come in and do some investigative work. It's determined that it's not a crime. Do a little further work. Are they native? Are they not native? And if they're determined to be native, then the property owner can, give them to the local tribe. And so I've seen many MOUs and MOAs being developed across the country on this type of process, state or sheriffs, state police, property owners, the county, and so on and so forth, where NAGPRA is not really applicable, but you still want to do the right thing. And for when I was practicing NAGPRA years ago, that's what we did. We got out there and tried to bring awareness. We did different newspaper, different media, to show that the tribe is doing this as a government function. There's a government department, and also just to give people the heads up that, hey, if you do find human remains when you're putting in a basement or a pole barn, there's a process in place. And people started to contact us over time. And sometimes I would go to lunch, and I would come back from my lunch and there would be a box on my desk. It always seemed to happen at lunch. So people know you're gone. And I'd come back and it would be a box, and inside the box would be skulls and teeth and vertebrae, and there'd be a note. And the note would say, we saw that you do this and your department does this of returning, bones or human remains. And, we found these years ago on our property, or we were putting in a basement and we didn't know what to do. So we just boxed them up. But now we know that there's, a resource available for these types of situations. So that would happen a couple times a year, that we would have these, I call them the donations, and people just wanted to do the right thing, but also there was a sense of distance and probably a little bit of guilt that went with this, but they did it anyway. And we're always grateful, that they were doing this. So that's something to think about in terms of land in relation to, tribes and repatriation and so on and so forth. So this is a map from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, under the Department of Interior. And it just kind of gives you an idea of where tribal lands are within the United States. And you can see it's very, very diverse. It's primarily to the west that you see these really large, reservations, tribal lands, with Arizona and New Mexico. And of course, you see Oklahoma being a huge, tribal area, Dakotas, and so on and so forth. But there are some tribal lands east of the Mississippi. And I stress that quite a bit, because a lot of times the Eastern tribes kind of get lost in the conversation. That I've talked to people and they didn't know that there was tribes east of Mississippi. They thought they all got removed west. And it's a pretty sobering conversation to say, no, some of us weathered the storm, and we're still in, our homelands east of the Mississippi. So northern Minnesota has some quite large reservations. There's tribal lands in Wisconsin. There's some tribal lands in Michigan. But then you get out of, the upper Great Lakes, and you can see that the tribal lands are pretty sparse when you get into the southeast region, or what they call the eastern region. And that's the byproduct of this Indian removal. So it's not by a mishap that this eastern region is almost devoid of tribal lands. There's some pockets of tribal lands and in the east, but everybody was getting pushed out. Some survived, some made their stand. They stayed in their homelands east of the Mississippi, but so many got removed. And that's why you see this large, this massive area, primarily in eastern Oklahoma, that is Indian country. It's tribal lands. So if you're just starting out in Nagpra, this would be a good map just to have handy. Where's my state? Where's my institution? Where do I fall within this map of Indian country? And if you're, starting new at an institution, say in northern Arizona, well, that's Navajo, huge reservation. Or if you're starting out in Oklahoma, like, oh, you got your work cut out for you. There's 40 different tribes in this state, but where are they originally from? Then you got to do that extra leg of homework to see where these removed tribes are originally from, and vice versa. If I'm looking at, I'm starting a job at a museum or for a state like in Kentucky or Tennessee, and I say, well, according to this map, I don't have any tribal lands. But again, step further with your homework, those tribes are west. And I need to figure out what tribes those are and start to build some type of consultation with them, some type of relationship, because those tribes absolutely apply to the process, to their original homelands. But this is a pretty sobering map for me as a Native person to look at this. But it tells quite a bit, and it's very helpful too as a non-Native practitioner to see if I'm within the boundaries of a reservation, or if I'm not, if I'm close to a reservation or I'm not, or if I need to start looking at these removed tribes. Something that's very important to know in Nagpra is possession and control. So under the law, possession or control are important terms for agencies and museums, as well as tribes, to understand. It's very important for an agency or museum to identify if they have possession or control of their Nagpra collections. So a large part of my consultation process when I was doing Nagpra was asking, do you have the items? Do you have the remains? You may have published an inventory or summary years ago, but that doesn't mean that you have everything that you said you had 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So I really emphasize a museum who's just starting out in this process to make sure that they have their, what they say they have. And so possession is having the physical control of the remains or the items. And control is the legal say, the legal jurisdiction of those items or human remains. So possession and control are two very different things. And sometimes a museum will have these items, but they don't have legal control because it's on loan from another institution. So that's something you have to look at very closely too, is do I have items on loan where things just dropped off 20, 30, 100 years ago? And is there any type of paperwork that goes with this? So you may have something, but you may not have legal control of it. It may not be legally yours. It may be stored for somebody, it may be on loan, or it just may have showed up. And I've seen this happen a few times at museums where they have no idea where they got these items or remains from. And it's unfortunate, but it happens. So if you're in this situation and you're going through and just making a physical assessment of everything, so I need to know what I have. I have to have physical integrity established. I need to know where things are, how many, what kind of shape they're in, where they're housed, are they being housed properly? These are all things you have to establish immediately as a museum. And this process could take years. If you have a very large institution, you have to go through a lot of different departments. Things are hiding. I've seen situations where people take items out of the collections and they put them in an exhibit, or they loan them, or they end up on people's desks, or they end up in people's cabinets. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. So having that physical integrity, I really stress that your possession is good, that you know what you have and you know exactly where it is and it's stored properly, and that you have, it's in a safe environment, not just with climate controls, but access. So you don't have people coming in and out all the time and looking at things or taking things. That your Nagpra collections are well accounted for, but they're also locked away so things don't walk off. And I've seen this happen in a few different scenarios where things did walk off. In one case I was working on, it was with a university, and once I started contacting the university about a set of remains that they had, word got through the university really quick that, hey, there's this tribal rep asking questions about these human remains. And the person I was working with at the time, it's straight out of a show or a movie. He was a tenured professor there, and I had to call about 5 different people to get to this guy. They kept passing me around. I don't do Nagpra, this person does it. But finally, this professor said, you can't call me at my office. You got to call me at my home. Here's my home number and call after these hours. I'm like, okay. So I called. And his wife would answer the phone and she'd yell in the basement, and he'd come up the stairs. I could hear all this going on. And he's like, we're working on it, but it's going to take some time. I'm investigating it. So call back in a week. And so this went on for weeks. It was very, very strange, intriguing. But long story short, one of the professors who heard about this call that the university received was the professor who actually dug up all of those remains. So he made a career off of this. He published, he taught classes, and once he found out that the tribes were interested in having the remains repatriated, he got very cagey and went to the extreme of trying to literally take all of the remains off campus and put them in his own private research facility on his own property. And the university intercepted him, and literally they intercepted him moving the remains through some tunnels underneath the campus. So the police had to get involved. They had to seize all the remains. They had to threaten this professor with being fired. So that's the extreme. And it doesn't always happen, but it just reiterates the fact of having control or, the possession, and then the control issue came in. Like, who has the legal right to make decisions on these remains? It was the university. It was their collections, but this individual was seeking to take them out. He didn't have control. He, for a short time, had possession because he had the physical remains with him, but he didn't have control at all. So we had to really stress that that emphasis with the university and their lawyers to get these things back, and that what was happening was actually illegal, and that this was not a normal process, but it was also an illegal process. So long story short, possession and control are very important to have within your organization. And again, this could take years. It could take, a great amount of manpower and hours to do this. And there's grants available to help with this. I know a lot of museums I worked with in the past, there's one person doing this. So, and they're doing, 10 other things. That's a lot. The same with tribes. There's one person doing Nagpra on top of 5 other duties. So it's understandable. This takes time to do this, but the important part is you have to start doing it if you haven't done it. So a little bit more about, possession and control. We talked about agency or museum may have control of some remains, but may not have physical possession. We already looked at that. And it has to be decided who has control. In one case that I worked on for a repatriation of human remains, the remains were from one site, and it was from a federal property. And the remains were from a federal property, and then the federal property kept half of the remains, and then a museum was there helping with the dig, and they took the other half. And this was 70 years ago. So the collection was split. The individuals were split in half, and that's how it was for 70 years. Fast forward, I contact the federal agency. I said, you published an inventory. It says you have so many remains. They're from our state of Michigan. We're from Michigan as these tribes. And, we want to start talking about repatriation, consultation. And quickly, it got very complicated where they said, well, we have only half of them, and we don't think we have control. We think that the museum has actual control. They have the other half, but they have control over the entire collection. So we contacted the museum, and they said the exact same thing. Well, we think the agency has control. We have possession of X amount of remains from that site, but we don't have control. So this went on for about a year of who has control. And it was finally established that, yes, the agency has control of the remains. They went and got the other set of remains. The collection was whole, and then we could go forward with the repatriation because we had, the one body making the decisions. But it took a great deal of phone calls and consultations and patience to get this established. So that's something that occurs. I saw more and more where collections were split from the early to mid 20th century, where people would have these honor systems, I call it, where we'll return it later, or we're studying these, we're using this for this class or this report, and we'll return them later, but they never do. And so these collections, these people kind of hang out there for decades. So that's something you have to, again, really figure out within your organization. And federal agencies are much more likely to have collections on loan to other institutions. I saw this all the time. Some large universities and museums will have things on loan or people on loan, but usually it's the federal agencies. So always check to make sure. And I sat on the Nagpra review committee for a 4-year term. And so I got to see a lot of different cases and scenarios being developed or resolved or talked about on my term with the board. But this is about 10 years ago, 10 or 11 years ago. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they had, at that time, I don't know what the situation is now, but 10, 12 years ago, they had, I think, 17 different repositories where they had collections, whether it's human remains or sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony. So they're all over. And a lot of these repositories were not owned by the BIA. They were having these loan agreements that were established. So that's really important to note. If there's a loan agreement, you have to have a up-to-date copy of it. So terminology, of course, it's really important in any line of work, but especially in Nagpra. I had to learn a lot of different terms very quickly, so I would know what people were talking about and vice versa. So again, there's a unique application under Nagpra such as museum, and then dispute is something that happens quite a bit between museums, and or federal agencies and tribes. So this is when there is no mutual agreement on a repatriation or any different process under the law. A tribe or lineal descendant can dispute what the museum or federal agency is doing, and we'll talk about that later. Inventory and summary are two very key terms, but they have different implications. They're not the same list. Inventories apply only to human remains and associated funerary objects with those remains, and summaries only apply to unassociated funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and sacred objects. So we have two different training modules just on those because they're that important. We looked at control and possession, and knowing these terms helps to accelerate the process and have much clearer consultation. In my ignorance of this, when I first started, I kept thinking that inventories and summaries were the same. And I kept saying this in my conversations, and I was quickly corrected saying, we're only dealing with human remains, so summaries don't apply. So it's like, okay, then it's inventories. So it was a quick learning lesson for me, but a very important one because you got to know what we're talking about. And a full description of these terms can be found on the National Nagpra website here. And this is one of the best sources of information. I was on this website constantly when I started, even after I got pretty well established in how to do the process. I was always going back to the National Nagpra website. It's updated, it has a lot of information. So it's one of the best resources in terms of carrying out the law. So again, we looked at what the term for museum, any institution that has received federal funds. Tribe, there's a very legal definition of a tribe that we looked at. Federal agency is pretty straightforward. And I didn't know just how many federal agencies there were until I started looking to see. There's hundreds, but you'll see the bigger ones like Department of Defense, BLM, the National Park Service, the BIA. Those are the ones that have more of a lion's share of NAGPRA work and collections, especially in terms of land, lineal descendants we looked at, and also we can't forget the Native Hawaiian organizations. Hawaii often gets forgotten in a lot of these conversations regarding NAGPRA, but that's not right. A lot of Hawaiian ancestors and items have found their way to the mainland, and they're in museums all over the continental United States. And so the NHOs have been working really hard to have those ancestors and items returned. This is a quick rundown of some of the key terms that you'll see all the time within the NAGPRA process. Some are used sparingly, like civil penalty. There's not a ton of civil penalties being levied against museums, and actually no civil penalties will be levied against federal agencies because the United States can't sue itself. But once in a while, a museum will get hit with a civil penalty. But NAGPRA grants are one of the big, I think, tools that you could use. And we'll get into grants a little bit later. So this is just a quick list of some of the key terms that you'll hear all the time when doing the work. Some more key terms. And these first two are ones that are specifically for tribal nations. And a traditional religious leader is spelled out within the law. And a traditional religious leader is unique to every single tribal community. It's unique to every single individual. They're not all the same. That's the first thing. And a traditional religious leader is designated through the tribe. And this person could change over time. There can be multiple traditional religious leaders within a community. And they also have different ways of operating. Some will be open to having maybe Zooms or conference calls. Some want to meet in person. And there's certain protocols, cultural protocols, according to each individual and each tribal community of working with traditional religious leaders. But they are written into the law. They have a say within the law. And many times these are the PhDs or the experts, so to speak, within tribal communities. And so they have this vast amount of knowledge when it comes to culture, spirituality, ceremonies, protocol within those communities. So they absolutely have to be worked with if a tribe has one. Sometimes a tribe will not have one of these leaders and they go forward anyway. It's not absolutely necessary, but they're certainly there for the tribes. And THPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Not every tribe has a THPO. It's a federal program. That's just a very, very dynamic program in terms of helping to preserve culture and language and properties and so on and so forth. But not every tribe has an established THPO office. Some do, some don't. Sometimes the THPO for a tribe is also the Nagpra representative, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the THPO and the Nagpra rep are two different people. That happens. But sometimes they're one and the same. You have to look at the tribal government structure, who you're working with, to determine that, and not automatically assume that the THPO is a Nagpra. And if I talk to the THPO, they're going to handle all the Nagpra. You can't assume that. You got to double check. And so SHPOs often work with THPOs, and this is another good resource to have because of their knowledge of a lot of the sites within their own states. They'll have information pertaining to different burial sites and cultural sites, just from archaeology work. A lot of times THPOs and SHPOs work very closely together on their task. So it's also very advisable to know who your SHPO is within your own state. We talked about inventory and summaries. The designated federal officer, the DFO, is within the National Nagpra program. And then we have the National Nagpra Review Committee and the National Nagpra program itself. So the last three are specific to National Nagpra. They work closely together. Actually, the DFO is part of the National Nagpra program, and the Review Committee is a separate body from the National Nagpra program that advises. So the National Nagpra Review Committee normally would meet twice a year at different locations throughout the country. And that hasn't happened, obviously, with COVID in the last couple of years, but hopefully things get back on track. And if you're new to Nagpra, I really advise to go to one of these meetings, and you can see how Nagpra is being carried out. You can see the people involved, and it's just a really great way to network and meet people. And some of the review committees I went to actually facilitated repatriation because we were working with a museum from New York, and we were working on the repatriation of an unassociated funerary object. It was a small copper kettle, and copper kettles are very indicative of burials for our people. So anytime I seen that on any type of summary or inventory, right away, a red flag of this is important. And we worked through the process. We put in our repatriation claim for this little tiny kettle. They knew it was from our homelands. They knew the village. It was a pretty seamless repatriation. And New York is not very close to Michigan, so we were trying to figure out how to do this. Do we apply for a grant to go get the kettle? Do we have it sent through the mail, which some tribes do? And the lady who I was working with at the museum in New York, she said, well, I'm going to be in Seattle for the review committee meeting. How about I just bring the kettle to you and you can carry it home? It's really small. It's literally the size of a coffee cup. And I said, there we go. So we met in Seattle at the review committee meeting. It's actually my first meeting as a board member. And she met me at break and said, here it is. And it was packaged in this nice little box. And I took it home and reburied it. So there's a lot of ways you can use a review committee meeting to do some work. So grants. Grants are something we utilize as much as possible when I was working under Nagpra. We don't have an infinite amount of resources. We're pretty finite, actually. So we are trying to get as much help as we could to carry out the work. And the grants were really, really helpful in helping to facilitate repatriations for us. So the National Nagpra program offers two types of grants: repatriation and documentation consultation grants. These grants are available both to museums and tribes. I've seen museums and tribes partner together on these grants. Federal agencies are not eligible for these grants. So the repatriation grants are non-competitive and are awarded on a first come, first served basis. And the maximum for these grants is $15,000. The documentation grants are competitive and the maximum is $100,000. These grants correspond with the federal fiscal year. And then you can just go to the National Nagpra website under the grants page to see more details about this. But the repatriation grants are just for that. It's for returning people and items. And we used several of these grants when I was doing the work to literally just pay for travel to go and get people, renting cars, paying for lodging, paying for food, paying for fuel, just doing the basics of getting our ancestors back. And for several of our repatriations, we had to go out to Nebraska and get these 6 individuals that were from Michigan. They were ancient, they were 2,000 years old. We worked with the museum. They returned, they would say, we're not looking at the timeline, we're looking at these as people that through the consultation process, your belief, your tradition, your language is saying that, 2,000 years ago, you were in Michigan as a Anishinaabe people. These are your ancestors, and we're going to return them. But Nebraska is a hike. It's quite a distance from northern Michigan, and I didn't want to fly with human remains. I didn't want to have them checked on, and I didn't want to have any type of incident happen. So we made the decision to drive out to Nebraska. And I say we, it's me, myself, and I. And we applied for a repatriation grant. And that helped. I mean, it paid for everything. It paid for the entire trip. So we rented a car and we planned it that going out to Nebraska, I got the human remains. And then coming back, we had another repatriation lined up in southern Wisconsin for some sacred objects. So I was able to do 2 repatriations in one trip. So we lined everything up. And so the grant could actually cover these 2 separate repatriations because it was right along the way. And so it was really beneficial, and got to Nebraska and got to individuals. There were, like I said, six skulls. And I asked the museum staff, where are the rest of the people? And said, this is what we got 100 years ago. And she showed me the ledger that the museum 100 years ago purchased these 6 skulls. And this was a common practice all across the country, where looting and the desecration of burials resulted in some type of economic driver for people. They were going and looting, especially during the Depression era, and people were buying human remains of natives, especially skulls. There was some weird fascination, some morbid fascination with native skulls. So the skulls are there. The bodies are probably still back in Michigan, hopefully. And so that's what we had. And we packaged them up and brought them home. And on the way back, stopped in Wisconsin, got the sacred objects, and completed the trip into northern Michigan. And the protocol I was taught to do this was you rebury as soon as possible. So as soon as I got back to northern Michigan, took those 6 individuals and put them into the ground. And so was made possible by this grant through the National Nagpra program. And the documentation grants I've been a part of on the other side with museums and helping them consult where they need help. And a lot of these grants that these museums apply for is just to get their documentation in order to create an up-to-date and accurate inventory and or summary. So they need to know how many human remains we got, where they are, where are sacred objects? Are they sacred objects? Are they objects of cultural patrimony? And they would oftentimes hire an individual as a consultant to come in and carry out this work because they just don't have the bandwidth or the expertise to do this. So these documentation grants are really useful and helpful for museums, especially these smaller museums, of getting their collections up to speed and their inventories and summaries up to date. So just a little bit more, and I've seen a lot of these repatriation grants utilized, especially from very far-reaching communities in Alaska and Hawaii, and that's just, they got to make. I can't complain about driving to Nebraska when somebody has to fly from Hawaii, say to East Coast, or if you're coming from Alaska and you're going into Florida, or just massive amounts of distance. Some of these communities have to travel in order to carry out repatriation, and some tribes aren't comfortable sending things through the mail. They want to be there to do the physical carrying back home, especially with human remains. So this is something I've seen many, many times, and I carried out myself. I didn't feel comfortable at all sending ancestors through FedEx. So we would make the effort to go and get those people no matter where they were. So the grants really, really helped with that. And we already talked a little bit about how documentation grants can help a museum who doesn't have the resources get the work done. So this is actually a photo of me many moons ago doing that repatriation out in Nebraska. So this is the actual final transfer, signing the paperwork. My colleague in Nebraska was very cordial, excellent to work with, and had everything ready. This was a quick repatriation. It took about maybe a year and a half, which is pretty fast under the law, from first phone call to pickup. So usually they don't go that fast, but all the pieces were in place for this one to happen really quickly, and largely in part because of my counterpart on the other side at the museum. Just couldn't ask for a better partner to work with on this. Timely in their responses, had everything ready, wanted to go through the process, knew this is the right thing to do, but they also had to had the law to fall under, that they had to follow the law. And at times we had to remind museums that this is a law that is federal and that applies to you. So you have to follow the law. I mean, not to bring the hammer down, but once in a while we would get pushback about certain aspects of the law. And I'd always have a copy of the law and the regulations on my desk. So if we got into these sticky situations, I could point to certain aspects or the regulations of the law and say, this is what I'm referring to in terms of consultation. It says you have to consult with the tribe. I'm a tribal representative who is contacting you. You have to consult with me. And consultation isn't just a phone call. We have a whole module on consultation. So it's that important. And in this repatriation, I mean, looking at this photo, it's bringing back a lot of memories of driving to Nebraska. And it was in April, and it was during tornado season. And it was a hairy trip. It was very stressful. Sirens were going off. The sky was turning green. I thought I was going to get swept up and tossed across the state. And tornadoes hiding in the shelter at the hotel. And it was a powerful time. And all of this was to get the ancestors back. And it was just this deluge. It was pouring rain when this photo was taken. And just thinking, that it was just so energy, it was so charged with everything going on. And then driving back, and as soon as I got maybe 50 miles out of that city, things just calmed down and had a very smooth journey back home. And I remember getting back to my hotel because I couldn't make the drive in one night. And I got back to my hotel and I was really anxious, like bringing those remains back into my hotel room. And but of course I did. I didn't want to keep them in the car and lock them up, and that safety again. So I brought them up into my hotel room and put them on the table and was scaring myself all night. And like, nothing bad's gonna happen. We're doing the right thing. And of course nothing happened at all. But I didn't sleep that good that night, but the next night I slept very good after we reburied them and put them back. So this is just one of a few stories I like to share, because I like to do my teaching through stories. That's how I was taught to do this work. So that's just one of this photo really reminds me of that whole experience, which was very good. Another big aspect of Nagpra is the review committee. It's an advisory board appointed by the Secretary of Interior, and it follows the FACA guidelines. The committee is a commission composed of 7 individuals representing the tribe and the scientific community, and there's 1 consensus member. And their responsibilities are monitoring and reviewing the inventory process and repatriation activities. And they request information on compliance with the law, and they also make annual reports to Congress. They also hear factual disputes on matters regarding Nagpra between tribes, NHOs, native villages, and between museums and federal agencies. The rulings of the review committee are advisory. They are not legally binding. But I've seen where one of the cases that when I was sitting on the review committee, so I presented to the review committee multiple times when I was a practitioner, and then I switched roles where I was appointed to the review committee and got to hear a lot of different cases, and actually heard several different disputes between a tribe and a museum. And one of these disputes involved a sacred object, an object of cultural patrimony, and the tribe and the museum just couldn't resolve their issue. The tribe wanted the item back, and they put in claims. The claims were denied by the museum. The museum said they had legal right to this item and that they bought the item from the individual. They had a receipt. Everything was legit. And the tribe pushed back and said it wasn't under the authority of this person who sold that item to sell the item, that it belonged to the community. That is community property, an object of cultural patrimony. So they couldn't come to terms, and finally they had to go and present their dispute before the review committee. And it was one of the most difficult meetings I've ever sat in any type of atmosphere ever, where you had this very thick tension in the room about this item. And it was an Alaskan tribe, a community that was presenting, and many of these individuals had to fly all the way to the meeting, which was in Washington, D.C. And just talk about the long journey some of these people had to make. And some of these elders were in their 80s, and that they were talking about the role that this item had in their communities. And part of their consultation was different types of songs and dances and the presentation. And they had similar items to the one that was being requested. It was really powerful. And it still, at the end of all of this, the museum claimed that the items was there based on the purchase. And the review committee, during that dispute, we ruled in favor of the tribal community, saying that this should go back. It should be repatriated. But again, it's advisory, not legally binding. But that community used that ruling from the review committee, and its next step, which was litigation against the museum. So they actually had to go and sue the museum to get that item back, which they eventually did. So it was a very long, very expensive process for that community, but that's how strong they felt about it, to go that length to get this item back. So disputes don't always happen. It's usually the last step if a museum and a museum agency can't work it out between a tribe. And a lot of times, we try to have steps in between before we get to that stage of trying to resolve this, bringing in mediators, having consultations, so on and so forth. But that's part of the review committee's job, is to oversee these disputes. And again, I really recommend going to these meetings just to have this opportunity to meet people and network. The review committee may make findings of fact pertaining to cultural affiliation and the return of items. And they also help develop regulations to carry out Nagpra. So these regulations are often, brought before the review committee. Review committee has say in them, recommendations. And there was a really big shift in the Nagpra world, I believe in 2010, when new regulations were introduced, 10.11, which we'll talk about when we get into inventories of how all Native American human remains have to go back. So this was a huge shift in the law, but the regulations had to be amended to include that all Native American human remains have to go back. And we'll discuss that later. So this is just, again, another photo. This is one of the meetings I actually sat in. I'm drawing a blank. I think we're in New York. They move the meetings around quite a bit. So that gives people an opportunity to come to the meetings. And that's by design. You know, one meeting will be out west, one meeting will be in DC, one will be on the East Coast. Sometimes a museum will host, sometimes a tribe will host, sometimes a federal agency. So there's never any one set way that a meeting will be played out. It's always different. So they're always looking for different venues and different audiences that they can reach with these meetings. Oh, this is at the National Museum of the American Indians. So there it is. This is in DC. So another big component of the Nagpra process is the Federal Register. I had no idea what the Federal Register was until I started doing the work. And then within, I think, a day or two, I was like, this is absolutely critical in the process. And the Federal Register you have to have a Federal Register notice published before any type of repatriation can occur. So publishing it is a mandatory for remains, for unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony. No matter what it is, it has to have a Federal Register notice. And there's different Federal Register notices for different categories. And this is the responsibility of the museum or the federal agency. They have to write and publish the Federal Register notice. That's on them. But the tribes can help. They can help with these notices with information. And we've helped quite a bit, actually, when I was doing Nagpra, and just with names and places and contacts. Again, sometimes we're working with people who never did Nagpra. We're very new to the process, so we're lending our expertise just to facilitate the process to go faster and help them out. So you can certainly help with the institution, but again, it's the responsibility of the museum or the federal agency. And a Federal Register is a summary of the repatriation. It gives the basic details of what is being repatriated, some basic collecting history regarding the remains or the items, again, what category it falls under, and which tribes have been consulted, the number of items or individuals, and if applicable, which tribe it's being affiliated to. And the contact information for the museum and the agency is also included on the Federal Register. So it's a really great summary of the work, of what happened. And the Federal Register notice is to give notice to the entire United States that this is happening. And once the notice is published, it has to run for 30 days in the Federal Register. And during that 30 days, if anybody has any type of dispute or counterclaim or question, that is their time to raise those concerns, is within that 30-day window. And on the 31st day, if there is nothing of that nature that's being forwarded to the museum or federal agency, they can at that point transfer control legally of whatever is being repatriated to the tribe, individual, or group of tribes. So what we would do is we would wait, and then on the 31st day, we would request from the museum a letter transferring legal control of whatever we were repatriating to us. So from that point on, we had control of that set of remains or item. It was done. And the next step would just be to go and repatriate or go and have the physical possession transferred. So the Federal Register is an absolute necessary step. And again, it's certain Federal Register notices apply to different categories, and all of this information is on the National Nagpra website. So they have a whole page just on the Federal Register notice, the different types of notices, and there's a Federal Register notice coordinator within the Nagpra program, because it's that important that they have. That's one of their dedicated staff. And I remember when I first started working, I think I called the coordinator, her name was Jamie at the time, once a week, just to make sure I knew what I was doing, that that the notice was right, that it's not going to get bounced back and then get put in the, the bottom of the queue and take another month or two to get work through, because there's all these notices being put through the system. So we try to get, the most perfect notice from step one. And so it would go faster, but we made mistakes, of course, and we had to make corrections and then work through the process. So again, absolutely necessary to go through this process. And again, a lot of this information on just the steps, and there's templates on the Federal Register, the different notices on the National Nagpra website. So there are Federal Register notices for human remains that are different for Federal Register notices for sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony. They're two different notices. And this is just an example of what a notice looks like. You see, it's pretty compact, but it has all of your details. And I actually I was using these notices quite a bit to try to figure out who are contacts at different agencies and museums. So I go through and just do a advanced keyword search in the Federal Register notice for a specific year under Nagpra, and just and it's a great tool to try to find who is doing the work at an institution, because it's also very difficult to find out who's doing the work at a tribe. So these notices have all of that locked in them for that specific time period. Which leads me to finding Nagpra contacts at tribes. It can be difficult. Each tribe has its own government structure in which Nagpra is carried out. And the amount of resources for Nagpra varies from tribe to tribe. Some tribes have a dedicated staff, multiple staff. Some tribes have museums. Some don't. Some tribes have one individual who's doing 5 other things, and Nagpra is just part of their duties. And they just don't have the capacity or resources to do it full time. So it varies from tribe to tribe. So federally recognized tribes are tribal governments, and they all have websites. And so that's a really good place to start out, is going to a tribe's website. Again, all these websites vary. A list of the federally recognized tribes can be found at this website through the BIA and also from the Nagpra. This is just an ideal place to look for finding who is a tribe, and then looking at their website and trying to navigate now that I know the tribe, who do I contact within the tribe? So an ideal place to look first is, do they have a TIPO? Again, we said not every tribe has a TIPO, but if a tribe has a TIPO, I bet 99.9% of them know who the Nagpra person is if they do not carry out those duties themselves. So see if they have a TIPO, or if they have any type of history or cultural or historic preservation department. NAFPO is also a good resource for locating TIPOs. So that's one of the first places I would look, is this NAFPO website, to try to see who actually has a TIPO program. Some tribes have museums, some don't. So I would look, if I was doing this, does the tribe have a museum? Contact the museum. Do they have a historic or cultural preservation department? Is another place to find a Nagpra designee. In the event a tribe does not have a TIPO or a museum or historic preservation department, go up the food chain and contact a tribal administrator. And sometimes tribes have multiple tribal administrators depending on the size of the tribe. Some only have one. So that's something you can look at, and they'll know, who's doing the work within their government structure. And I would also look at to see if a tribe is maybe having a contractor. And this would be something you find out through the tribal administrator or the tribal chair. So these are your leaders within tribal governments. And sometimes if a tribe has very limited resources, or they just receive federal recognition and they're getting going, sometimes they will hire somebody as a contractor to carry out their Nagpra work, which is completely fine. And it is advisable to get a letter from a tribe establishing the selected individual who has the authority to act on Nagpra. So this is something we would do immediately when we met with a new museum. We would send them a letter from our tribal government on our tribal letterhead who authorize these individuals within our government to carry out the work. It could be a couple people. It could be one person, but it's really important that the museums know exactly who is in that official capacity and vice versa for the tribes to receive some type of authorization that we're talking to the right people and they have the authority to carry out this work. So it's always good to keep that, and then keep this up to date. Turnover happens, at tribes and at museums. Just to keep contact. If you haven't heard from somebody in a few months or 6 months, touch back and see. And if they're not responding, talk to the tribal administrator or the head of that department or the tribal chair, and see if a new person has been hired or so on and so forth. So keeping these contacts up to date is really important. So remains in Aboriginal land. Under Nagpra, all federal agencies and institutions, organizations, or government that qualify as a museum under the law must repatriate all Native American human remains it has under their control. So this changed about 12 years ago. This is mandatory, whether they're deemed culturally affiliated or not. This was a big sticking point between tribes and museums and federal agencies because so many human remains were being labeled culturally unidentifiable. And the vast majority of tribes did not agree with that terminology. That 1,000 years old, 5,000 years old, they are related to us. So the law had to change. That said all human remains that are Native American that fall under Nagpra have to be returned. Cultural affiliation remains have a shared group identity with a present day tribe, and the tribes have to establish that evidence. And this can be done through consultation. It can be done through, more scholarly academic work, such as reports and so on and so forth. I've seen a lot of hybrids. They do interviews with elders and they also submit a report. That's all feasible. Remains can be culturally affiliated and returned through consultation of the inventory process. So we've had this happen where a museum, they have these remains. Originally, they labeled them culturally unaffiliated, and they also need to update their inventory. The inventory is an updated list of all human remains that they have. So under the law, you have to consult. They consulted, and after talking with us, they said, no, we believe these are related to you. And so we're going to change it from culturally unaffiliated to affiliated, and they repatriate it. So that can happen. That's completely fine. It doesn't have to stay in one category. And again, we talked about how an agency or museum must have a federal register notice and this is called a notice of inventory completion, submitted before the repatriation can occur. So that's a federal register notice for human remains. NIC, notice of inventory completion. That's for affiliated or unaffiliated. Human remains classified as not culturally affiliated have a different mechanism for their return based on the Aboriginal land. So we're going to see a related training on Aboriginal land and Nagpra. Human remains in Aboriginal land is an important aspect of Aboriginal, an important aspect of Aboriginal land is the relationship between tribes and the areas of origin for human remains. So this is the definitions. Whose tribal lands at the times of removal, the human remains and associated funerary objects were removed. So these tribal lands are, again, we talked about these lands within reservation boundaries or lands held in trust by the federal government for that tribe. So that's number one. Number two is from whose Aboriginal lands the human remains and associated objects were removed. So Aboriginal lands is a much, much, much broader swath of land than tribal lands. Tribal lands are hyper specific to this day. Aboriginal lands cover states. So tribes moved a lot. They didn't stay in one county or one town. Sometimes tribes covered 5 or 6 states, and that is their Aboriginal land base. And that has to be accounted for, and especially with these older sets of ancestors. So figuring out what that Aboriginal land base is takes a lot of consultation with specific tribes, but some resources to help you get started in understanding these large land bases is final judgments issued by the Indian Claims Commission the ICC is a good starting place, or by the multiple treaties that the United States signed with various tribes across the country. Over 400 treaties were signed. Unfortunately, all of them were broken at some point, but during the treaty process, tribes were ceding land to the United States, sometimes tens of millions of acres. And when the tribes ceded that land, the United States recognized that tribe as having, that's their Aboriginal land. So treaties are a very important resource, or any type of act of Congress related to tribes and land. But me personally, I would look at the treaties first in conjunction with consultation from the tribes. The regulations also allow federally unrecognized tribes to participate in the repatriation of human remains and permit museums and agencies to rebury remains when no tribal claims can come forward. So there's a process in place now that, one, remains from tribal lands has the strongest or the most defined claim. We know exactly what tribe is there. They're there the present day. Aboriginal land's much broader. This can be one tribe covering 5 or 6 states, or it could be a group of tribes working together because they recognize that they have this shared territory. That happens too, of these joint repatriation claims, especially for these really large areas. Tribes know their histories. They know that some of this was shared territory, and they work together. So many remains are going back under these Aboriginal and tribal lands. Well, what about if a museum has a collection of remains and there's no information? They just don't know anything about them. There's no documentation, there's no records. There's still a process for those remains to be reburied. And those remains can be reburied by the museum, actually. If they go through the whole process of tribal lands, Aboriginal lands, doesn't apply. We don't even know what tribe this is. We know they're native based on some forensic information or other archaeological information or collection history. We know they're probably native. If we can't determine where they're from, we as a museum can actually rebury them at a designated place. So that's there to ensure that all of the ancestors go back in some way or fashion. But many times museums will work with tribes to do this. They just don't do it on their own for the most part. I also think it's very important to understand a little bit about the history of Indian law, because Nagpra is Indian law, and see how it fits into this continuation of relationship between tribes and the United States. Tribes have numerous federal laws related to civil rights, to children, land access, religion. They have a unique relationship based on these laws. It also has a trust relationship based on historical agreements and interactions with the federal government. So our relationship with the federal government is vastly different than all other people within the United States, namely because we were here first, but also through this whole time of war and invasion and movement, that treaties and these legal agreements were established. And so this creates this trust relationship, which is very unique for tribal people. So here are some specific laws that tribes have passed that have to give us more equality in the United States. You can't go back and fix the past, but try to address some of the historic injustices of that has happened between us and the United States. 1924, we had the Indian Citizenship Act. Native people were the last population to be granted American citizenship. That's one that still is a little bit hard to swallow. 1934, we had the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, often called the Indian New Deal. This legislation was created to give tribes more economic development and to preserve culture and promote tribal governments. There's a lot of different opinions on the IRA, for good and bad. But at the end of the day, this is Indian law to, in some respects, help restore government and to develop economics. But on the other hand, it was government through a Western lens, through how government should be established according to the United States with the Constitution. Tribes had to develop constitutions and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of pros and cons to the IRA. ICC, the Indian Claims Commission, due to the egregious undercompensation tribes received for ceding their lands under hundreds of treaties with the United States allowed tribes to sue the nation to receive equitable payment. So this happened officially in 1946, but for the previous decades to 46, tribes were suing the United States en masse due to not being paid. You know, they made these agreements, they inked their names to it, so did the United States, and the United States just refused to pay. You know, the tribes were ceding millions and millions of acres to the country, and they were supposed to get compensation. And so they had to sue. And this took literally, I think, 50 years for the ICC to conclude its last case. But through that work, you know, a pretty incredible body of information was created. Tribes had to show their relation to a treaty, their history, and to their relation to land. So the ICC dockets are out there, they're online. And it's just another tool to have in your toolbox in determining, you know, who your tribal communities are, and also in relation to land. The 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act, until this law, many tribes were denied freedom of assembly, speech, and press, especially on their own tribal lands and on federal lands. Not a lot of people know that we have our own Civil Rights Act. ICWA in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Due to a large number of children that were alienated from their families, either through social services or boarding schools, this law was created to keep Native communities intact. ICWA still is very much a law. It's always under the gun. I actually think it was before the Supreme Court in the last couple of months of whether it should be disbanded or not. So tribes are constantly fighting for ICWA to be in place because it keeps Native children who have to go into the system within the Native system, within their own tribal courts and social services and Native families. And this is largely due to the boarding schools that were, 400 boarding schools were in operation across the United States from the 1870s until the 1980s. So over 100 years, these schools operated, and kids were, being taken from their communities through a plethora of mechanisms into these institutions of forced assimilation. And a lot of times social services was part of this. So it was there for a very important reason. And the Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, this law gives Native Americans the full right to practice their Native religion, use their objects, and access to sacred sites. And again, I really feel Nagpra is closely related to this law. And then of course we have Nagpra that was passed in 1990. And this law focuses on the return of Native American human remains and cultural items and the protection of Native American burial sites. Some helpful hints. Always have a copy of the law and the regulations readily available at all times. Understand the basics and what you need to do to be in compliance with the law. Have current up-to-date Nagpra contacts for everybody, museum, tribe, federal agencies, even the tribal, the Nagpra program themselves. Just have those contacts handy. Have paperwork from each organization authorizing an individual to perform the work. Keep those contacts up to date and get new letters if need be. Consult as much as possible and face-to-face whenever possible. You can't consult too much. The most successful repatriations I was a part of, I've worked on over 30 successful repatriations in 7 years. And the easiest, shortest time span, we consulted sometimes weekly. They just had questions or concerns, or am I doing this right? What do you think? Where's your tribe from again? What village is this? What's the spelling on that? We have somebody coming into our office saying that they're from your tribe. Is this true? No, they're not. They're not even from Michigan. Don't talk to them, please. So all of this was going on constantly, and it just made for a very, very smooth process in the end. And the archivist in me, has to say solid organization and accessibility of records and information is so important. That you have your information that is precise as much as you can be, but also well organized and digitized as much as possible. So in case you have to share information, and just make sure that your records are up to date and are legible and readable and easily accessible. Also understand that tribes are independent and unique. They operate as what they see as best based on the resources available, and there are different priorities within each tribal government. Tribes have natural resources, they have housing, they have health clinics, they have youth services, they have courts, they have police, they have a lot of moving parts. There are governments that provide services and programs for their people. So a lot of times a tribe may be slow in responding because they have a lot going on. It's not you, it's just life. Be mindful of that, and that some tribes are at just different levels of resources and manpower. Recognize that tribal oral histories and traditional knowledge are equal lines of evidence under the law. Tribes are not a homogeneous population with the same customs, culture, and religious practices. We're all different. Even within our own tribe, there's different opinions on religion, on culture. But my tribe, the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, we're vastly different than the Squamish out on the West Coast. We're vastly different than the Comanche and the Seminole. And you just have to take the time to consult and know who you are talking to and working with. Do not rely on public perception, sports, or media to make the determination of tribes. Talk to tribal people themselves. Attend as many trainings, Nagpra review committee meetings as possible, and network with others in the field of repatriation. What I found when I was doing the work, that people are more than happy to help each other. It's a real community that just wants to see the work get done, and they'll loan their expertise and their advice and just try to help out. So don't be afraid to ask for help down the road. Pursue the grants as much as you can. They're there. That's what the money's for. Utilize them. Contact the National Nagpra program and its website as much as possible. And I'm still in touch with them, and they say, yeah, that's what we're here for, to provide these services. And Nagpra goes beyond the law for many tribes to include reconciliation, recognition of denied beliefs, and the exercise of tribal sovereignty. So it's a very, very, I would say, emotional, very intimate, and very in-depth process when going through these repatriations with tribes. We're looking at things that go back thousands of years. We're going back to reconstruction of beliefs, reconstruction of language, exercising sovereignty. And the history of tribes in the United States is often an ugly and messy story, but this is one of the few times that tribes are able to reclaim. And it's a really powerful moment and movement a lot for tribes when they're going through this process. So just want to be mindful of that as you go through the work. The return of sacred objects and rebuild of human remains is something a tribe is not always ready for. Sometimes tribes just don't have property. They don't have 10, 40, 30 acres of secure land that they could put ancestors into. They have to find this out. So sometimes it takes extra time. Where are we going to rebury these people? Who's going to go get them? And then within our own tribal communities, we have to consult with our elders if this person is the right person. Do they feel comfortable doing this? So there's these cultural and ceremonial protocols that we have to follow through on our own end before we even make a phone call a lot of times to a museum or federal agency. So please be mindful of that. And some tribes may not repatriate human remains or certain objects based on their cultural protocols. And that's their prerogative. That's their sovereignty speaking. I've been to museums. They said, Eric, we've got these remains. We want to return them, but the tribe just won't come and get them. I was like, that's their belief. Sometimes the tribe believes once they come out of the ground, they don't touch them. And that's okay. That's their belief. And you have to honor that. And some items, some tribes don't feel comfortable having in their possession or working with based on what that item represented or represents still to this day. It may be something that they don't feel comfortable using or bringing back. Nobody knows how to use it. Nobody knows how to communicate with it. Maybe it's an item that needs to be retired and nobody knows how to do the ceremony. You got to be mindful. All of these things that tribal people are dealing with is for tribal people. And a lot of this information and knowledge has been systematically extracted out of tribes for over 100, 200 years with institutions of forced assimilation and civilization policies. So give tribes time. So I want to say thank you. miigwech in my language of Anishinaabe for taking the time with me today. And feel free to reach back out to the National Nagpra program or myself. And I want to say thanks again for having the opportunity to share this. This is a big part of my life and my work. I no longer do the practice, carry out Nagpra, but it's very gratifying to come in and help others with this training. So with that, I want to say thank you.